Hi everyone, welcome to Aurelian Coaching Weekly. My name is Nicole Littman, and this week we are talking about critical thinking. The reason we're talking about critical thinking is because I think that we should incorporate more critical thinking in our day-to-day lives. And where I have seen conversations around critical thinking cropping up is only in situations where there's a lot at stake, where there are major decisions that need to be made. This is usually in the workplace, but it's also at home as well, where there are judgments that need to be made. And that's the time when critical thinking really matters. But it gets hard if you're not putting it into practice daily. So I thought, well, let's talk about how to put critical thinking skills into practice in our day-to-day lives. So I looked up critical thinking models. I don't know if you guys have ever done this. It took the wind out of me. It took the wind out of me. I printed some of this stuff out because it's so crazy. So here's one model. You see that? It's got, oh, I showed it to you upside down. Oh, there. It's got arrows and yes, no, and all these conditional things and all these boxes. So I clicked on that and then I closed it. And then we have something like this. They didn't use arrows, but they used pie charts, right? There's a lot on there. And for each pie chart, they have a separate circle of all these questions that you have to answer. I can't do that either. That's too much. Like this, I'm looking for something where we could just apply in the moment, okay? I couldn't find anything. Here's another one. This one's beautiful. It has all kinds of colors, right? Look, all the arrows and all the boxes and all the colors. It was too much. And I thought, how are we supposed to even just teach our kids critical thinking skills if all we have are these complex academic models? So I read through them, and you know what, to be fair, there are people who geek out over this stuff, and I do believe that there's value in those complicated models. So I'm not saying toss them entirely. All I'm saying is they don't have practical purpose day in and day out when you're trying to apply critical thinking in the moment, right? So there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. So I always, if you guys have been following me week in and week out, you know that I'm big on definitions. So that's where I started here too. I looked up the definition of critical thinking, and it was so elegant in its simplicity. It was beautiful. It said, the analysis of information in order to make a judgment. That's it. That's really beautiful. And there are only 3 nouns in that definition, right? There's information, analysis, and judgment. I'm like, there's a model right there. Super simple model, right? So I started to think for each of those categories, information, analysis, judgment, really what questions are absolutely necessary to ask yourself, okay? And I came up with a set of questions that for all those complicated models, all of their questions could basically be categorized into one of the ones that I came up with. So let's start. So for information, I recommend that there are only 3 questions that you have to ask yourself in the moment. One is the information that you're getting accurate? Can you independently validate it? Is it, can you verify it, right? Or is it really subjective and it's not something that you can base a lot of analysis on. So it has to be accurate information. So do whatever you need to do to ensure that it's accurate. But number two, and this is a big one, is the information relevant to the question at hand? And the reason I love this question is because we are just drowning in information, right? There's so much information out there. And I actually have a client of mine that I was coaching her on a very specific work-related issue. And week after week, we would get on these coaching calls. And I mean, she's brilliant. She's super smart. But she would spend 10 minutes telling me everything that happened in the last week. And it was like this data dump. And she would be like, okay, well, what do we do about this? And, I mean, it's easier for me because I was an outside observer and she was in it, in the weeds, in the thick of it. But I was like, I'm not sure any of this is relevant to the problem that we're trying to solve for. It feels new, right? You get new information, you immediately want to assess this, how does this impact everything, right? And you're talking to people that may have a role in forming a judgment at the issue at hand, but if the information that you're getting from these people is not relevant, you need to put that aside. Here's the other thing. If you can't tell if it's relevant, guess what? You still have to put it aside. You still have to put it aside because you can't just stop, right? If you are on a critical thinking path, right, and the goal is to make a judgment, and you can't tell if the information, a certain piece of information that you have is accurate, you can't independently validate it, or you can't really tell if it's relevant yet, that's okay. Don't stop. Put it aside in a parking lot, okay, and keep going, all right? So for information we have, is it accurate and is it relevant? The last question you need to ask yourself is it logical? Again, because we are swimming in data, we can lose sight sometimes of just applying common sense. This happened a lot on some of the teams that I worked on, where you get so in the weeds and suddenly you're like, wait, this doesn't even make sense. It doesn't back up. Back up, right? So, and I don't know how much of this was in the complex critical thinking models, but it was one that I felt was super important. So I definitely want all of us to, when we're assessing information, to just put our common sense hat on and say, is it actually logical? Okay, so that's information, okay? Next is analysis. I love this part. This is where the model gets super crazy simple. I love this because analysis is the part that is so subjective. Don't kid yourself that analysis of information is supposed to be super objective. It is absolutely subjective, okay? So there are two questions that you need to ask yourself once you've been able to validate the information, okay? And you find that it's accurate and relevant. And that is, the first question is, what are you making it mean? That's the first question on analysis, is you have to interpret the information. You have to make it mean something, right? So that's number one. Number two is you have to decide what assumptions, perspectives, viewpoints are being layered on top of that information, okay? Now, those are only two questions, and they're pretty simple questions, but they're not necessarily simple to answer. But really, that's all you need to ask yourself is, what am I making it mean? and what are the assumptions that I'm layering on top of it. Okay, now, so now that I've explained analysis, I'm going to further simplify the analysis step. So you have to ask yourself, number one, so what? That's the interpretation part. So what? I have all this information, so what? Okay. And then number two is what if, right? Because you are actively deciding to layer on assumptions. Whatever viewpoint, perspective that you're bringing to the table, somebody else has a different set of assumptions, perspective, principles that they're also layering on top of it, right? So you have to realize that in your analysis, you are actively choosing what assumptions, principles, viewpoints, perspectives you are putting on top of that information, okay? Analysis, again, subjective. So you are choosing to make the information mean something, and you are choosing to layer on certain assumptions. Now, the beauty of this is because it's an active decision that you're layering this information on top of it, you could just as well choose to layer something totally different on top of it. That's the what if part of it, right? So you have data, and you could have two totally different people. Maybe they're coming at it from completely different perspectives, but they may still apply the same meaning, right? You could have people from the exact same perspective. They are applying the same assumptions to the data, and yet they make it mean something totally different, right? So that's why don't conflate those two questions. The so what and the what if are totally different, and you can play around with it. It's so cool. Finally, judgment. There's only one question that you need to ask yourself on judgment, and that is your conclusion, right? So we start this whole exercise. There is there is a question that you're trying to answer. There's an issue at hand that you are putting through this critical thinking funnel, right? So you start with information. You're asking three questions there. Is the information accurate? Is it relevant? And is it logical? Then you go to the analysis step, and there are two questions you ask there. So what? What am I making it mean? And what if? What if I apply different assumptions and different perspectives? How could that change my analysis? And then the final piece of critical thinking is judgment. And there's only one question there, and that is, what is your conclusion based on your analysis? Is the answer to the question yes or no? Is it, does it support a certain action or not? Does it help you conclude something in a positive light, in a negative light, or in a neutral light? Okay, so this is my critical thinking. I love this model. I love it because it's super easy to apply just day to day. So I call it the 3-2-1 model. So if you guys are in Skill Masters, you're going to get this in your email tomorrow. You're going to get the tool, but if you read the blog post from this week, I actually shared it. So here's my 3-2-1 model for critical thinking. Can you see it? This is so easy. It's so easy, right? Imagine walking your kids through this. I mean, they could get this, right? But especially in the workplace, or when you are trying to sort through huge amounts of data with your teams, to simplify to this model, when you're trying to make judgments, especially when time is of the essence, this really narrows things down. It really focuses things. I love it. So use it. Use it, and then let me know what you think, because I've been applying it, and I find, I'm so in love with it. The 3-2-1 model for critical thinking. Okay, so that's the content this week. Sneak peek for next week. we're going to be talking about managing up. So I've done a number of interviews recently with people who are mid-career managers, and they're, I asked them about what their pain points are, and I got a lot of different, everybody's got issues, right? I got a lot of different answers. But the one thing that kept coming up again and again was this concept of managing up. And again, I'm all about the definitions. So I would ask people, what do you mean by managing up? Like, you can go to the Harvard Business Review and they have all these articles about managing up. So that's all fine. But when I interviewed mid-career managers, I'm like, what do you mean by that? And I got a lot of different answers. Some of it has to do with just that feeling like they're between a rock and a hard place as a mid-level manager, right? So they have all these responsibilities to all their direct reports. They themselves have their own duties and responsibilities in the role that they have to fulfill, right? And now they're reporting up not just their individual contributor work, they have to report up with all their teams and all the individuals that are working under them. And there's a lot of concern and question about how much is, how often should I be keeping people in the loop in leadership, and, how much is too much, how much is not enough, and at what frequency, and there's all this drama about it. So I like to simplify things, so as you know. So next week we're going to talk about managing up, and I'm going to give people some tools that they can implement and some guideposts that they can use to kind of simplify things a little bit, so they're not in this sort of river of information and just feeling the stress just wash over them. So look for that next week, and until then, have a great week. Check out AurelianCoaching.com if you want to sign up for Skill Masters. Bye-bye.